Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again once to look at eco views and news, and in particular the problems we're facing in quick succession of climate change, government inaction, and civic response at a time when the seasons are changing. We're looking at, in effect, an age-old problem which has been with us in the English language ever since Shakespeare focused on it and gave it a very memorable phrase. The Ides of March has to do with changing of seasons, but in a particular play, Julius Caesar, it had to do with a warning given to Caesar: beware the Ides of March. Why? Well, because in Elizabethan times they thought that changes in the natural world foreshadowed changes that would be coming up in the social and political world. And Caesar was warned by a visionary in his path that he should beware of the Ides of March, that time of the year when there's a switch from the winter season to the spring, and the violent weather that often accompanies that, the exceptional weather, the lightning storms, the floods, the torrential rains. So we're going to be looking today at that whole question of beware the Ides of March, omens of unnatural change, confusion and conflict within political elites, and the simultaneous rising call for civic action among citizens around the world. Of course, this has nothing to do with Shakespearean times, but it has to do with our times. And we ought to beware of the Ides of March, and particularly with these omens of unnatural change. We're beginning to get scientific reports on a daily basis almost now. Here at Harvard, one of the most eminent climate scientists was quoted in a title to an article indicating that carbon pollution has shoved the climate back at least 12 million years, Harvard scientist says. This is Jim Anderson, who you may have heard me talk about before. He's been very active in the faculty support movement for the students to divest from fossil fuels, and he's very focused on trying to get students to understand just how much is at stake in the climate change we're facing. He's emphasizing the unprecedented nature of the change. We've shoved the climate back at least 12 million years. Well, humans have only been around as a species for about 1 million years, depending upon how you separate them from our biological relatives. But 12 million years is, in effect, the comparable climate that we're driving towards on the Earth's surface. In other words, we're headed for a climate that humans, not just Americans, but all humans, have never seen before. Many argue that this is just a matter of natural variability, and things come and go, and we have warm periods and cool periods and the like, but the scientists have looked at the statistical probability of that being a natural event, and as one summary article in Discover magazine put it, the record global warming streak from 2014 to 2016, a snowball's chance in hell that this was natural. This is being forced by human activity, namely the emission of carbon blanketing gases, methane and CO2 in particular, from the combustion of fossil fuels, largely coal, natural gas, and petroleum. Scientists have also emphasized that they look at the whole global heat budget over decades and over 5-year periods like this 2006 to 2010, that there's an extraordinary accelerating heat, particularly up in the polar areas, which has given rise to rainfall in Greenland during the winter. This is very rare. This is one of those unnatural omens. That would be like the Ides of March. Take a look.
In climate news, a new study finds rainstorms are becoming far more frequent across Greenland, even in winter, accelerating the melting of vast areas of ice and setting the stage for global sea level rise that could inundate coastal areas home to hundreds of millions of people. The study, published in the journal Cryosphere, found warmer temperatures have led to increased rainfall in Greenland, which triggers widespread ice melt and runoff, contributing to the 270 billion tons of Greenland's ice added each year to the Earth's oceans.
270 billion tons each year added to the Earth's oceans from the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. Staggering. And this has very immediate implications for those of us who live on the coast, like anyone in Boston or Cambridge or anyone, the entire eastern seacoast, or even more generally the post-Columbian city, that is the city set up since 1492, pretty much at sea level, because that's the way trade began to take dominant forms after the intercontinental discoveries of Columbus. We're in real trouble here because it's precisely those post-Columbian cities that are under threat all over the world. And you might think in particular in a continent like Africa, its capital cities have been set up as a historical epiphenomena of the movement of the populations from the interior toward the coast during the slave trade period, the last 500 years of African history. Well, things are bad. And in fact, the scientists aren't the only ones saying it. Now the journalists have been coming out with more and more alarming news, including books like The Uninhabitable Earth, subtitled, Life After Warming by David Wallace-Wells. It's a staggering account. Take a look.
It is worse, much worse than you think. That's the first sentence of David Wallace-Wells' terrifying new book about climate change. It's called The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming. In it, Wallace-Wells marshals the latest scientific research, which he argues points to one unimpeachable fact, that our use of fossil fuels, which has admittedly powered so much prosperity and growth across the world, is now the single greatest threat to our survival. One that he says, quote, has brought us to the brink of a never-ending climate catastrophe. David Wallace-Wells is a fellow at the New America Foundation and a columnist and editor at New York Magazine. Welcome.
Thank you.
I have to admit, I have not been as alarmed by a book as I was by yours, and I feel like I know a lot of what you're reporting on. I should tell, we've also posted the first chapter of your book on our website. I would encourage people to read it to get a sense of the argument that you're making. But help us understand what you think people don't quite appreciate about the severity of this problem.
There's sort of three big things. The first is speed. I think we had long thought that climate change was happening very slowly, that it was unfolding at fastest at about a decade timescale, more usually like centuries. And then we didn't have to worry about it in our own lives, maybe even our children's lives, but it was something to worry about for our grandchildren. More than half of all the emissions that we put into the atmosphere in the entire history of humanity we've done in the last 30 years. That means that we're doing this damage in real time and in the space of a generation, so the speed is really overwhelming. And if we lived off the coasts, we often thought that it was a matter of sea level rise and we'd be safe, we could live inland, that would be okay. In fact, it's an all-encompassing threat. It's not compartmentalizable to the coast. It's much bigger than sea level rise. It impacts the economy, which could be 30% lower than it would be without climate change by the end of the century. It impacts public health, conflict. We could have twice as much war because of climate change at the end of the century. That's the second thing, the scope. And then the severity. Most scientists talked about 2 degrees as the sort of threshold of catastrophe.
2 degrees Celsius.
Yeah. And that's about twice as much warming as we've had today. They describe that threshold as the threshold of catastrophe. We're on track to get to about 4.3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And that whole range is really unconscionable in terms of how much climate suffering it would impose. We've only just begun to see peaks of it with wildfire and extreme weather. I think in the coming decades we're going to see much more of it.
Yes, in the coming decades we're going to see much more of those natural omens, the kinds of Ides of March that were warned about in prophets to Julius Caesar and encapsulated by Shakespeare in his play. This is really quite staggering because this is no longer a play and it's no longer fiction. It has to do with elites not understanding things. In addition to the natural omens, there's confusion and conflict within political elites, and you can't see a more thoroughly confused elite than we've got now in power in the United States, doing some very silly
The
things.
demonization of carbon dioxide is just like the demonization of the poor Jews under Hitler.
That right there on CNBC is William Happer. He's President Trump's pick to lead a panel countering the science of human-caused global warming. We have the facts. Trump has actively challenged his own government's conclusions about the causes of climate change and its threats. He's often touted environmental deregulation and his abandonment of Obama-era steps to confront climate change, while promoting his America First economic agenda.
It's a hoax. I mean, it's a money-making industry, okay?
Trump plans to establish a presidential committee on climate security through executive order. It will be funded by the National Security Council, and its board of scientists will meet privately without needing to disclose public records of their meetings.
Now that's the key there. These so-called scientists are going to meet privately and nothing will be known about their meetings. But he's likely to use the outcome of those meetings from this hand-picked, cherry-picked group of retired scientists who don't hold any teaching positions anymore, and who are dead set against the 99% of scientists on the climate issue. He's going to use those scientists to justify what he wants to do.
The council will advise Trump on how the climate might change in the future, and it could give the president more ammunition to ignore all the climate change evidence already out there.
And there's the architect, a physics professor emeritus at Princeton. Really quite staggering. If you look into it, you can find more on Transition Studies TV about this at great length. At the same time, there's a rising call for civil action. And it's coming from the youth at this point. Really quite staggering. A 15-year-old Swedish girl started this back last September. Since then, she's turned 16, and her scope and reach has gone far beyond Sweden. She inspired students in Belgium to call a student strike, as she had called one in Sweden. And she wants politicians to listen to the scientists, not the phony scientists that they handpick, but the 30 years worth of scientific evidence that have been put together around the world. It's worth listening to her appeal. It's absolutely stunning. 16 by this time, speaking to the European Economic Commission.
Tens of thousands of children are school striking for the climate on the streets of Brussels. Hundreds of thousands are doing the same all over the world. We are school striking because we have done our homework. And some of us are here today. People always tell us that they are so hopeful. They are hopeful that the young people are going to save the world. But we are not. There's simply not enough time to wait for us to grow up and become the ones in charge. Because by the year 2020, we need to have bended the emissions curve steep downwards. That is next year. We know that most politicians don't want to talk to us. Good. We don't want to talk to them either. We want them to talk to the scientists instead. Listen to them. Because we are just repeating what they are saying and have been saying for decades. We want you to follow the Paris Agreement and the IPCC report. We don't have any other manifests or demands. Just unite behind the science. That is our demand. When many politicians talk about the school strike for the climate, they talk about almost anything except from the climate crisis. Many people are trying to make the school strikes a question of whether we are promoting truancy or whether we should go back to school or not. They make up all sorts of conspiracies and call us puppets who cannot think for ourselves. They are desperately trying to remove the focus from the climate crisis and change the subject. They don't want to talk about it because they know they cannot win this fight. Because they know they haven't done their homework, but we have. Once you have done your homework, you realize that we need new politics. We need new economics where everything is based on a rapidly declining and extremely limited remaining carbon budget. But that is not enough. We need a whole new way of thinking. The political system that you have created is all about competition. You cheat when you can, because all that matters is to win, to get power. That must come to an end. We must stop competing with each other. We need to cooperate and work together and to share the resources of the planet in a fair way.
You can tell these are penetrating words. We understand the politicians don't want to speak to us. That's okay. We don't want to speak to them either. Really, quite amazing. And when you follow her impact around the world, it's staggering. It's also led to other groups, like that co-founded by Roger Hallam, that are in effect starting to resist in one country after another. He's here in London. Take a look at the interview.
First part of our discussion of the impending ecocide and our resistance with Roger Hallam, the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion.
When a society comes under enormous pressure and contradiction, then the reason why that regime falls is because some people in the elites do side with the general population, and the general population rise up, and the elites sort of disintegrate into chaos because they're no longer virile, and they're not really standing up to what's coming, because they know they've totally failed. And I think this is the fundamental thing that's happening in world culture, at the moment, and every month and year from now on, is the elites know they've failed catastrophically according to their own criteria. So this is the final stage, I think, in the next 2 or 3, 4, 5 years.
There is one desperate chance left to thwart the impending ecocide and extinction of the human species. We must, in wave after wave, carry out nonviolent acts of civil disobedience to shut down the capitals of the major industrial countries, crippling commerce and transportation, until the ruling elites are forced to publicly state the truth about climate catastrophe, implement radical measures to halt carbon emissions by 2025, and empower an independent citizens committee to oversee the termination of our 150-year binge on fossil fuels. If we do not do this, we will face mass death.
Okay, now that's just the beginning of an interview with Roger Hallam. You should look into it. Their statement is very clear. The climate crisis is an unprecedented emergency. Too little is happening to prevent disaster. We need to do more. We need to begin a campaign of civil disobedience. The Extinction Rebellion is an emerging international movement empowering and supporting people willing to take creative actions that risk arrest. Each of us has a moral obligation to preserve life and the earth that sustains us. Extinction Rebellion, keep an eye on it. There's their logo. You'll see it again and again. It's an emerging international movement. Some of us has taken this right over the heads of nation states to the UN itself to try to make this case very clearly to anybody who can understand the UN English or its translations. Take a look. We're facing the fact that we've done cost-benefit analysis and looked only at the benefits, not looked at the cost. The whole carbon bubble, the carbon moment in human history, is one great big gaspillage of a resource with no cost accounted for in terms of its impact on a global functioning ecosystem. If those costs were internalized, you'd be paying $57 a gallon for gas, right? So, yeah, we got to get the metrics straight, but we also just have to move off of carbon. Not because it's becoming more scarce. A few years ago, we used to think, on one of the graphs I used, it was the peak oil question that was the great anxiety. We're going to run out of stuff. Well, in fact, we're not going to run out of fossil fuels in any known future, especially with the new technologies used in fracking and the like. It's not the scarcity of the material, it's the impact of the material. We can't survive using that amount of carbon. Just on the post-Columbian city basis. Post-Columbian cities are those that were put in place after Columbus discovered this is a new world. He didn't discover it because it wasn't lost, right? But in any case, the post-Columbian city was put in place, pretty much, at sea level. Because that's how we got here, right? On a boat. The post-Columbian city is under challenge. If you didn't see the graphic here, 1,400 cities in the United States alone. We can't survive in those cities with the combustion of terrestrial carbon. This is why the new movement that's emerging is called the carbon underground. We're trying to keep the carbon underground. And you start doing the metric for that, you measure progress in a very different way. Not how much carbon have you used, but how much have you sequestered? How much have you prevented from being used? Second point about other alternative energies, use the renewable ones. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that nuclear is a solution to anything. If you want to look at externalized costs, think about the tens of thousands of years of the waste products that you have to deal with. We don't even have human languages that are persistent long enough to label the stuff. Right? There used to be a department within the DoD, the Department of Defense in the United States, which is actually trying to think of symbol systems to put on nuclear waste dumps so that people would know after a nuclear exchange had occurred to stay away from this material because it was lethal, because the languages wouldn't be around anymore. Right? We can't cope with the downstream impact of nuclear, let alone the downstream impact of carbon. So don't think nuclear is the solution to this. What you got to do is run the whole thing on the solar throughput. Now that means water, wind, tidal, micro, hydro, and the like. That is, hydro is a function of the water cycle, and you're placing yourself back into a solar-driven system. But the only, see, we've got the thing 180 degrees around. We think we live on a planet with infinite resources and finite energy. We're struggling over to control that finite energy. In fact, in America, it's so absurd. We think that the world doesn't quite get it. That's our oil in the Middle East, right? It's just a geologic mistake it's in the Middle East. But it's our oil. And we spend a few $billion a day sort of making sure the world understands that. It's our oil. We're on the wrong metaphor in the sense that it's not infinite energy that we have moved to, and we need to. The infinite throughput of solar energy. We're thinking we've got finite energy and infinite resources, whereas in fact we have the finite resources and infinite energy. Okay, well the case is being made through the UN, but beware the Ides of March. omens of unnatural change, confusion and conflict within political elites, and the rising call for civic action, particularly this new movement of youth and the Extinction Rebellion. Fortunately, there is a new citizen science alliance.